right, we wanted to continue the conversation we were having on Friday's show about the lack of federal domestic terrorism statutes on the books and what that means for law enforcement and prosecutors. Back with us is State Attorney for Palm Beach County, Dave Arenberg. Also with us, Vice President for Third Way's National Security Program, Mieke Eoyang. Hi, Mieke. Nice to meet you. Good to have you. Good to have you in the show. I've been watching you over the past few months going, I can't wait to have her on. Same name. Exactly. But let's start with Dave Arenberg and the lack of a statute on the books, Dave. I mean, we've had stories in the past 6 months of domestic terrorists, even targeting journalists like us and analysts, and nothing can be done. It seems to make no sense. Any headway from a prosecutor's point of view of a way to get around this?
Mieke, there has not been headway in passing the needed domestic terrorism law, but the state of Florida did lead the way in passing a red flag law about a year and a half ago after the Parkland massacre. That law is being used by law enforcement to get a judge to take away guns from someone who's deemed to be a threat to himself or others. It's been used about 2,500 times in the state of Florida in the past year and a half. That's about 5 times a day. It seems to be working, and it should be a model for the national folks if Joe's buddy, the Senate Majority Leader, would ever call it up for a vote.
Well, what would that take? I mean, it seems that would be something that would make a lot of sense for Joe's buddy. What's in the way of it?
Yeah, well, it's politics. You know, you have NRA politics. You know, the politicians in Washington, D.C. have been cowed by the National Rifle Association, and they need to have some courage and to start addressing an issue that nearly every American seems to support, some reasonable gun safety laws. You know, one thing that I find encouragement in, though, is that we have seen much better cooperation at the local, state, and federal levels when it comes to combating terrorism. These are lessons from 9/11. And at the South Florida level, where we have 7 million people, we have a fusion center that has 132 different agencies working together to swap information and perform joint training exercises. And what's interesting is that center has been focused on international terrorism until recently, when the focus has shifted to domestic threats. That's a sign of the times.
All right, Mieke, from a national security perspective, what is your take?
I think this is a real challenge, and we have to understand the differences between domestic terrorism and international terrorism. On international terrorism, it's much easier for the U.S. government to work with other nations to identify these terrorist threats and their connections to overseas terrorist groups. When we're talking about domestic terrorism, we have a lot more complicated of a legal situation involving the First Amendment rights of Americans. And what we've seen, and this happened when I was on the Intelligence Committee, is that the Republicans are really unwilling to look at the ways in which right-wing extremist language is driving people to violence. In fact, in the Obama administration, when they put out a report on domestic extremism through DHS, the Republicans pushed them so hard on it they had to rescind that. So you see a lack of will at the federal and national level to really focus on this problem, which is probably a far greater situation and a far greater barrier than the lack of a domestic terrorism law itself.
All right, we have the AP's Jonathan Lemire with us with a question for Mieke. Jonathan.
Hi, Mieke. Just walk us through practically what this would mean were this bill come into law. Like, how would this make prosecutors' jobs easier? You know, what sort of ramifications could we see? How could it help law enforcement on the ground? What kind of difference could this make for everyday Americans knowing they could sleep safer at night?
So one of the things that this law would do is allow federal prosecutors to look at people who are planning attacks. The challenge on this particular law on domestic terrorism is it requires a political motive, and so it's something where people are trying to intimidate the population. It's very hard to disaggregate the motives of people doing this from hate crimes and domestic terrorism. Are they intending to terrorize the population, or do they just hate a particular group of people? So it would help a little bit in addressing some of these challenges before an attack goes off, but it's not the be-all, end-all solution to solving this problem.
All right, Dave Arenberg, you're also looking at these ransom attacks on cities and towns. We had 22 happen in Texas alone. Explain these and what's being done to combat.
Yeah, Mieke, there have been more than 40 of these attacks. this year alone to municipalities, and local governments are being targeted because they don't have the resources that big corporations or big cities or states have, because local governments, especially the smaller ones, are on shoestring budgets, and they're less likely to invest in something today that will reap benefits long after the politicians are gone. But that needs to change. They need to invest in cybersecurity and firewalls. They need to bring on consultants. Maybe they can bring on John Podesta as a consultant to tell them how not to open up a sketchy email with weird attachments. And what's really scary here, Mieke, is that 2020 is approaching, and our elections are run by local governments. And so they need to fix this, and fast. And the FBI says that most of the attackers come from overseas, and so the FBI is doing their part. It's time for the governments themselves to build up the defenses now.
And Mieke, what is your take? It just seems like nothing gets done on some of the most important issues of our time.
Yeah, this is actually a very frustrating situation because we're in the middle of a cyber crime wave where we see as many as 1 in 4 American households hit by these kinds of crimes. The ransomware rates against small cities and other government entities are through the roof. And what's challenging about this is that you can spend all you want on defense, but we know, and I know this from my work in the intelligence community, a determined attacker will always get through. Some of these attackers are nation-state hackers from Iran or North Korea, but they're not all that sophisticated. And unless we are good at going at that human attacker on the other side, unless prosecutors are figuring out who that person is and arresting them, we will never make a dent in this problem. And right now, we are all defense and no offense.
All right, Mieke Eoyang and Dave Arenberg, thank you both for being on the show this morning. Come back soon. Great to have you both on. And we will be right back with much more Morning Joe.